So today I want to title the text, Gotta Find Another Way. And gotta is pronounced, spelled out G-O-T-T-A. Gotta find another way. Now I'll kind of explain where that title came from momentarily. But first, if you want to turn over to Proverbs chapter 6. Proverbs chapter 6 is the foundation, or the foundational verse of what I want to share here today with you for just a little bit. Proverbs chapter 6. And sometimes the Bible isn't very kind. Sometimes the Bible is very blunt. It's very, I'll go as far as calling it disrespectful sometimes to human beings. And this is one example of how blunt the Bible can be. So in Proverbs chapter 6, New American Standard Bible, starting at about verse number 6 or so, it says, "Go to the ant, O sluggard, observe her ways and be wise, which have no chief, no officer or ruler." Verse 8, prepares her food in the summer months and gathers her provision in the harvest. How long will you lie down, O sluggard? It says. When will you rise from your sleep? Oh, a little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest. Your poverty will come like the vagabond, and your need like an armed man. Now, the Message paraphrase puts it like this, starting in verse number 6. Take a lesson from the ants, you lazy fellow. Learn from their ways and to be wise. For though they have no king to make them work, yet they labor hard all summer, gathering food for the winter, but you, all you do is sleep. When you wake up, when will you wake up? But let me just sleep a little longer, this text says. Sure, just a little more, and you'll sleep. Poverty creeps up on you, robs you and destroys you, wants to attack you in full armor. So the big picture here today is that there are some people who just let stuff happen, yet there's another group of people who tend to make stuff happen. Thomas Edison said one time, many of life's failures are people who didn't realize how close they were to success when they gave up. Close to success. One day, last month, I can't remember what the situation was. I think I remember, but I'm not positive, so I'd rather not share it unless I'm really sure. But Juliana spoke up and said, quote, "You gotta find another way around your problem. You gotta find another way around your problem." So that started fermenting in my brain. Because if you listen long enough, and if you open your eyes long enough, there's messages, there's inspiration everywhere you go, whether it's in the grocery store or at work or driving down the road, you happen to hear something in the news. There's always something that can inspire you. So again, her quote was, "You gotta find another way around your problem." Now, have you ever heard something from a child that makes you say, aha, or give you some sense of inspiration or motivation? H.G. Wells said, if you fell down yesterday, stand up today. If you fell down yesterday, stand up today. Some of us in humanity, when we get knocked down, we want to stay down because of discouragement, because we've fallen on our faces so many times. A guy named, an author, by the way, his name is James Michener, he said, character consists of what you do on the third and fourth tries. Character is what you do on the third and fourth try. How many kids haven't you seen trying to ride a bicycle? And they get so discouraged when they try to ride a bicycle over and over again. Well, how many of us, when we try something after maybe the fourth or fifth time, we want to give up, we want to throw in the towel because we don't think that in fact we can do it. Shannon Alder writes, when you're standing in the middle of a storm, you have two choices. Again, when you're standing in the middle of a storm, you have two choices. The first is pray to God that the storm goes away, Or start praying to God that He gives you the wisdom to figure out why you're standing in the middle of a storm. Sometimes it's so easy to say, you know what, I don't know why I'm here, instead of seeing what opportunities are in the middle of the stuff that you're going through. I don't know about you, but I felt that way many times. Turn over to Psalm chapter 1. If you have a Living Bible or a little button on your iPhone or iPad, you can switch it over to that text. That's where I'll be for a few minutes. Psalm chapter 1, starting in verse 1. This text says, "Oh, the joys of those who do not follow evil men's advice, who do not hang around with sinners, scoffing at the things of God." Notice there's a comma there. It doesn't say hanging out with people who don't follow Christ, but those people who scoff at God, which is a big difference. Verse 2. "But they delight in doing everything God wants them to do, and day and night we're always meditating on His laws and thinking about ways to follow Him more closely. They're like trees along a riverbank, bearing luscious fruit each season without fail," the text says. "Their leaves never wither away, and all they do is prosper." Verse 4, "But for sinners, that's a different story," the text says. They blow away like chaff in the wind. They're not safe on judgment day. They shall not stand among the godly. Verse 6, "For the Lord watches," listen, "for the Lord watches over all the plans and paths of godly people. But the paths of the godless lead to doom." But the paths of godless people lead to doom. Chris Murray says, "Like the ant, I will find a way around any obstacle. Like a child, I will persevere with pinpoint focus." You ever met a child that you told them, "No, we're not going to go get an ice cream"? Sometimes they just don't take no for an answer. "Can we go to the mall? Can we go to the carnival? Can we go here? Can we go there?" And they just don't stop until it gets a little tense. Psalm 125 says, "They that trust in the Lord shall be as Mount Zion." That's a pretty substantial example, isn't it? Like Mount Zion, which cannot be removed. Think about that a minute. If this author, David, likens us to be like a mountain that can't be moved, he goes on to say, "But abides forever, as the mountains are around Jerusalem, so the Lord is round about His people from forever." So when we're supposed to be grounded, when we're supposed to be solid, when we're supposed to be determined, then nothing's supposed to move us. And I'll tell you flat out that I've been moved, I can't tell you how many times. Because at that moment, in that hour, in that situation, I was not rock solid in much of anything. The way God chooses to stay close to those who follow Him amazes me. Truly amazes me. And sometimes some of the darkest times in your life, God's the closest to you. Have you ever noticed that? That when you think you're all alone, when you think that nobody else is there, God's there. But yet when times are good, what happens to most of us? We tend to forget about God, don't we? We tend to forget about how good God has been to us. And then when things get hard and tight and scary and frustrating and makes you angry, it really tends to get you being drawn close to God again. Right. There's a guy whose name is Ernest Yaboa. He's from Africa. And I'm going to quote his text here in just a minute, a couple of times, because it really grabbed me. Again, his name is Ernest Yaboa, Y-E-B-O-A-H. He says, "If God gives you a seed," again, if God gives you a seed, He expects you to plant it. Listen to this. If God gives you a seed, He expects you to plant it. If He plants it for you, He expects you to water it. If He waters it for you, He expects you to prune it. If He prunes it and keeps it for you, He expects you to harvest it. If He harvests it for you, He expects you to store it. If He stores it for you, He expects you to keep it safe from getting rotten. And if He keeps you from getting it rotten for you, He expects you to account for the seed. Yes, life, he says, is all about purposely fulfilling a purpose. Purposely fulfilling a purpose. We're expected, he says, we're expected to be doing something at each moment of your life, or we live without being on purpose. So there's a job for all of us, that if we're given any sense of responsibility for anything, we're supposed to be doing something with it. How many times haven't you met people that sit on their giftedness? They sit on their purpose for decades, and they never really realize why they were born in the first place. I was at this graveyard just in the last couple of days, and it was very interesting that people in the 1800s on the gravestones, they would actually have not only their birth date and the day they died, but they would actually write out exactly how many days they lived. 52 years, 13 days. It was very interesting. So how many of us aren't maximizing every single day that we're living until the day that we're not able to live anymore? You know, our problem, we have so many problems. You and I have so many problems. We all have problems, right? But one of the problems we have is that we assume that there's a cap on what we can accomplish. Again, we assume that there's a cap on what we can accomplish, when in fact, there's really no cap on what we can accomplish. Is it going to come easy? Is it going to come quickly? Probably not. But there is tremendous opportunity if you view life as being limitless instead of having limits on what you're trying to accomplish in your own life. Jennifer Fulwiler writes, one of the most powerful things I've read about this guy named Brother Yoon's story. He was a pastor of a church in China who was very, very persecuted. And he writes, after facing weeks of torture, including electrocution, starvation, beatings, and having needles shoved under his fingernails, he was thrown in a box that was 4 feet long, 3 feet wide, and 4 feet high, where he would stay indefinitely. The day after he was put in this tiny small cell, he felt prompted to pray for a Bible. Now, come on. Why would you pray for a Bible in communist China being tortured? Because you were a religious guy, right? But he felt prompted to pray for it. It was a ridiculous idea, considering the story says that many people were in prison in that very moment for being in possession of a Bible. So he prayed and prayed, and within just a couple of days, guards threw a Bible into a cell. It doesn't make any sense. But God does stuff many times that doesn't make any sense at all. The story continues, I knelt down and wept, thanking God for this great gift. I could scarcely believe my dream had come true. No prisoner had ever allowed to have a Bible or any Christian literature, yet strangely, God provided a Bible for me. Though this innocent, the Lord showed me that regardless of men's evil plans for me, that God is still in control of my life. There's stuff that you and I just cannot explain why God does stuff. Good stuff, I'm saying. Good stuff. But in His grace, it's His mercy, it's His tenderness that, frankly, I don't deserve. And by the way, you don't deserve it either. The few among many understand that God can do stuff with or without our cooperation. God can do stuff with or without our cooperation. Time after time, I've read the scriptures that people who got stuff done leverage what they have in order for God to use what they have to get stuff done. Turn over to Exodus chapter 4. Exodus chapter 4 is a perfect example of God using something. And you say, this is such a silly example. Well, guess what? There's boatloads of other examples in the Bible. But God normally, if you read through the Bible, God uses stuff, not only stuff, and obviously people, to get stuff done. Exodus 4, verse number 1. Then Moses said, what if they will not believe me or listen to what I say? This is after the story of Moses, and God comes to him and says, I want you to go back to Egypt where you really literally ran from, okay, and be the leader to take the slaves that were in Egypt to get them out of Egypt. So this is the argument. This is the conversation that Moses is having with God in Exodus 4. That Moses said, what if they will not believe me or listen to what I say? For they may say, the Lord has not appeared to you. Verse 2. So the Lord said, what is that in your hand? What is that in your hand? And he said, a staff. This is Moses talking, a staff. Then he said, throw it on the ground. So he threw it on the ground, and it became a serpent, and Moses fled from it. So not only did Moses have this long staff, because he was, took care of sheep and other stuff, so he had the staff that he used every single day. So God told him to throw it on the ground, turn to a snake, so Moses ran the other direction, right? So which I probably would too, I might say, verse 4 says, but the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand and grasp it by the tail. Now, I don't know much about handling snakes, but the shows that I watch about people handling snakes, that's the last place to grab a snake.
That's right.
You grab a snake at the head and push down the head and make sure the mouth doesn't open and all that. But here it says right here, obviously God didn't watch the TV shows back then that I do. But anyway, it says here to stretch out your hand and get it by the tail. So he stretched out his hand and caught it, and it became a staff again. Verse 5. That they may believe that the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, has appeared to you. So in verse 6, so God took another step. So God said to him, now put your hand, in your coat. So he put his hand into his coat, and when he took it out, it was leprous. He had a skin disease on it, right? So verse 7, so they said, put it back into your coat again, and he did. And when he took it out, it was clean. So, and skip down to verse 10. So now Moses, he had the stick turned to a snake, back to the stick. He put his hand into his coat, came out, had a skin disease, put it back in, took it out, it was clean. I don't know, maybe he's slow. Maybe, I would probably get it after twice. So verse 10, he says, please, Lord, I've never been eloquent, neither recently in the past or now, and I know you've spoken to me, but I'm slow of speech, slow of tongue, he said, verse 11. So the Lord said, who's made man's mouth? Or who makes him mute or deaf or seeing or blind? Is not I, God. Now then go, and I will be in your mouth and teach you what to say. But he said, please now listen. And so he goes back and forth. So the story goes on and on and on and on. So all these excuses why he, quote unquote, can't do what God wanted him to do. How many people who have lived and died who haven't accomplished the things that God wanted them to accomplish in their lives because they're afraid. They're terrified. They don't think that they can accomplish it. If they really understood that it's not them anyway, because we're just regular old human beings that are made out of the same exact stuff. But when God becomes part of the equation, when we allow God to leverage our humanity, then God can do some pretty remarkable things with just us human beings. This interaction between Moses and God eventually changed the whole world, didn't it? I mean, really, if Moses would not have understood in time that God was serious about using him to do some mighty deeds, then things would not be the way they are right now. So I wonder how many of us looking back in the next 50 years or maybe 30 years, don't we want God to leverage us to do some great things? But we have to cast aside, we have to throw, we have to ignore, we have to forget about that terror that lives in our minds and our hearts every single day. Time after time, God leverages stuff. God uses stuff to make a difference in people's lives. And so I have to ask you today, what do you have in your hand? What talent do you have? What tool do you have in your hand that can literally make a difference in other people's lives? A lady named Jochebed, who was Moses' mom, just built a basket. And the story says that when Moses was a baby, I'm going to get into the whole story, she made a basket, put him in the basket, and eventually he was found by Pharaoh's daughter. What if Jochebed would not have made the basket? What if she would not have developed the skill? What if she would not have followed the hunch to build the basket, to put Moses in the basket? Hannah had this desire to be a mom, and she prayed to God and said, Lord, if you give me this blessing of being a mom, then I'll give back to you my son, my child. So she did. And then as a result of that, little boy named Samuel found David, who became king, and the Psalms, and that whole evolution, which eventually Jesus Christ came through his line. But what if Hannah wouldn't have been so persistent in her prayer and then followed up with her prayer to do what she said she was going to do in the prayer? Then Samuel wouldn't have found David, David would not have been around, and Jesus may not have come through that line. Does that make any sense? So it's all connected in every single way. So when we do what we're supposed to do, we're a part of that puzzle. We're a part of that quilt, if you will. So then when we don't do our part, then there's parts missing in the puzzle and the quilt that aren't connected properly, which then impacts people's lives, doesn't it? How about Ruth in the Old Testament? Ruth could have done other things. Could have decided to go to another place. But she decided to be at a certain place at a certain time and hang out with certain people to then again, we go back in time now from David to a point where if because she was obedient, because she loved so much, stuff happened that blessed not only her, but us today as a result of that, right? Or there was a boy in the New Testament who was infatuated with this guy named Jesus. And he was tagging along with this huge crowd, 5,000 some people, right? And Jesus was teaching, and man, he's not like the other religious people, and he's talking this simple stuff that even a child could understand. So they travel for hours and hours and hours, and all these people are getting hungry, right? And so Jesus, saw the people were hungry, and the disciples or the followers of Jesus came to him and said, "What are we going to do? We got to send these folks home. It's getting late, and they're hungry." And so Jesus said, "So what do you have?" "Well, we don't have enough money to buy food for all these people." And he said, "What do you have?" So they found this little kid who had just a basket of a couple loaves of bread and some fish. So what did Jesus do? The story is, Jesus leveraged the little bit, the story says, and made it a bunch so that everybody who was in the crowd, 5,000 people, were fed with the multiplication of the fish and the loaves that this little boy brought. The point is, the example is, I hope obvious, that God can multiply and magnify your little bit to do an awful lot if you have a desire for God to leverage the little bit, to offer your little bit because of the love and the compassion that you have for other people. And Moses had to be able to see past his own, I'll call them hiccups. I mean, Moses killed a guy, if you don't know the story. I mean, he saw an Egyptian harassing and beating up one of his own people when he was still in Egypt. And he got bent out of shape and killed this dude, and then buried his body. Again, we're going back and forth in time, I understand that. But Moses had some baggage. Anybody here don't have baggage? I didn't see a hand go. I mean, all of us have baggage. Well, guess what? God can leverage our lives even with the baggage that the mistakes, the errors, the lapses in judgment, if you will, over the years, right? Let me go back to what Ernest Yaboa said. If God gives you a seed, he expects you to plant it. If he plants it for you, he expects you to water it. If he waters it for you, he expects you to prune it. If he prunes it and keeps it for you, he expects you to harvest it. If he harvests it for you, he expects you to store it. If he stores it for you, he expects you to keep it safe from getting rotten. And if he keeps it from getting rotten for you, he expects you to account for the seed. Yes, life is all about, purposely fulfilling a purpose. We all have a role to play, his story is. We all have a part, a place, a puzzle piece to do for people in our lives. When you're struggling, I was really working on this text for the last couple of weeks, and this quote came to my mind. When your struggle becomes who you think you are, listen, when your struggle becomes who you think you are, your foot is locked on the brake of your life. You say it again. When your struggle becomes who you think you are, your foot is locked on the brake of your life. Have you ever, I know you have, you've gone down the road and this person is riding their brake? So you're not sure if they're slowing down, you're not sure if they're stopping, you're not sure if they can't decide if they're going or stopping, or they're going to turn without a blinker. They're just riding the brake. Well, guess what happens when people ride their brakes? Who, or whom, I don't know, who does that impact? That impacts the people behind them, right? So when you and I, let me share the quote again, when your struggle becomes who you think you are, your foot is locked on the brake of your life. So when your focus, when my focus is on our struggle, we hit the brake because we're looking backwards, we're not looking forward, yes? And that impacts everybody behind us, doesn't it? So isn't it important, if not for your own self, to keep your mind and your focus off of your struggle so that your foot doesn't get on the brake, that you keep your foot on the accelerator so people will continue to move forward? Because there's people behind you. All of us, there's people behind us. They're watching us. They're trying to keep up with us, whether we're slow or we're fast. In fact, I was told that when a person rides their brake consistently, they'll get about 8,000 miles out of their brakes. Whereas a person who doesn't ride their brake gets about 20,000 miles or so out of their brake. So I mean, just mechanically, it makes sense not to ride your brake. You and I have a choice every day to find another way if we want to really accomplish the things that God has called us to accomplish. And oftentimes it comes from looking at examples and stories that probably don't fit into your story. In other words, that there's people who have examples, there's people who have gone through journeys in their lives that are not exactly parallel with yours, but there's pieces in their story that are exactly where you're going through, but yet they're not on the same plane. The point being that we have to have our eyes and our ears open from people around us, that all they have to do sometimes is say a sentence or give you a quote or share a story, and it's going to give you that momentum that you and I need to get around a situation. Again, an example I shared a couple weeks ago, we headed down to Myrtle Beach and we stopped to get lunch, and gas in 95 is a mess. I'm talking 10 miles an hour for 25 miles, 35 miles. It was insane. I was trying not to turn into the Hulk. I mean, the muscles were just bulging out of my shirt. My shirt was ripping, and it was really getting bad. So I text Michelle, who lives down south now, and my sister's name is Michelle, and I was ranting and raving. She says, well, get off as soon as you can on Route 1, and you can go around the traffic. Well, Route 1 has a million red lights, but at least I was moving. You see, I was moving. I'd rather be moving, stopping with red lights, than sitting or going 10 or 15 miles an hour. So the point is, sometimes you got to be willing to sometimes you got to be willing to set your pride aside and say, you know what, I need help finding another way around where I'm going around. I need to reach out and ask for help. Guys, generally speaking, have a problem with that. The old saying is, guys don't like asking for directions, right? Well, guess what? The older I get, I will stop anywhere to ask for directions if I can get somewhere faster. Make any sense? Ralph Waldo Emerson said one time, shallow men believe in luck or in circumstance. Strong men believe in cause and effect. Ooh. Strong, let's kind of broaden the term. Strong people believe in cause and effect. Let's pause just a minute about that theme right there. There's a reason why stuff happens most of the time in our lives. Are you and I brave enough to look at the reason why stuff happens in our lives? Let me share it again. Shallow people believe in luck or in circumstance. Strong people believe in cause in effect. When I eat certain things, my stomach gets upset. When I eat a McDonald's cheeseburger, a double cheeseburger or a quarter pounder with cheese, I know, unless I take a probiotic, by the way, which is a great way to eat a double cheeseburger and not get sick, but that's another story. If I don't take a probiotic, I know, because I don't eat that way these days most of the time, that I get sick. So there's a reason. So sometimes we do stuff that we know is going to cause us issues, but because we want to do the stuff, we don't care about the issues, then we regret the issues because we didn't care about the issues before the issue was going to affect us. Does that make any sense? Don't ask me to repeat that, because I can't. So there's times that we do intentionally stupid stuff, and then regret that we do the intentional stuff, but at the moment, we didn't really care about what the effect was going to be, so we did it anyway. Mercy. You and I have that struggle, I think, many, many times. Again, the title today is called Gotta Find Another Way. Now, there are situations in our lives where I think God brings what's called serendipitous situations in our lives that we could not have planned for. Let me share a little story, a little backstory about that term, serendipity. Now, it was actually an Arabic term that describes, quote, accidentally being in the right place at the right time, like bumping into a good friend or some unusual location, or finding $100 bill on the ground. Mercy. That'd be nice right about now, wouldn't it? So the story where the word serendipity came from, I thought was an interesting story, so I'd like to share it. It's called The Three Princes of Serendip. Serendip. The Three Princes of Serendip. A long time ago, the three young princes of Serendip decided to go forth into the world in search of glory and treasures and honor their father and gain his favor. They decided to not travel as high-born princes, but like every man, so that no one would seek to curry favor with them or give them any special toys or gifts or anything. So they found that by traveling in this manner, they found much harder and human suffering along the way. But they also discovered, quite unexpectedly, great and wonderful good in the most unlikely places. Upon their arrival home, and after a number of years were traveling, they understood what serendipity meant. So one of the tales told by these three princes to their father, the king, was about a merchant that they encountered. The three princes had ridden for a number of days, and they were attracted by the sound of wildly roaring water. They decided that the river must be nearby and went to look. They found the river with its wildly roaring waters, but beside the waterbank was a man dressed in rich robes which proclaimed him to be a merchant. But the merchant was crying and cursing the gods. Three princes asked him why he was crying and cursing the gods. Catastrophe, he said. He wailed loudly, cursing the evil that fell. He said, I've been cursed. Tell us what happened to you, the three princes said. Perhaps we can help you. No one can help me, moaned the merchant as he looked sadly at the river. For there is the river like my fortune, the story says, and future happiness. I, as you can see, was a merchant and have traveled through many kingdoms, building great wealth and collected the finest of treasures. I returned here to this river to build my palace and on these banks, and to the house my treasures and wealth. Never in a long memory has the river ever overrun its banks. But now it has destroyed my palace, stealing my treasures and most of my wealth. The merchant continued to moan. But you have been given a great blessing, cried the princes, confused and bewildered. But they said, the merchant demanded to know what they meant. You have been blessed. For if you seek the good in your misfortune, you will find even greater fortune. Again, when you seek, let me find that again, pardon me. For if you seek the good in your misfortune, you will find a greater fortune. We thank you for this lesson. And with that remark, the three princes rode off to leave the merchant to think upon their words. A few years later, when they were returning to their home, the kingdom, they happened to ride back over the same river, and they remarked that there wasn't this place that they had met the merchant. Yes, that was the same place. At that moment, a servant came running to them and bid them to come to the master's house to enjoy the master's hospitality. The princes followed the servant to a beautiful palace built high up on a cliff, looking over the river, and were greeted at the door by the very merchant that they had met just a few years before. The merchant greeted them with great joy and bid them to rest, refresh themselves, and join them for the evening for dinner and have so much fun. That evening they had a splendid dinner, and the merchant told the tale to the princes. He said, "After you left me, I pondered on what you said. And in doing that, I watched the river that had taken so much downstream. I realized that why had I built my first palace there as a young boy? I spent much time at the river, playing in its waters, whispering my secret dreams to it. I loved the river, but I thought as a boy that it had spoken to me. As a man, I'd forgotten how the river had spoken to me before. After a while, he said, this is not the place. Lift up your eyes, and you'll see, the story says. I looked and saw the cliff and realized that up there would have been a much more wonderful view, and I wouldn't be worried about the river overrunning its banks. But as my servants were preparing the ground, they came across a great field of gems of great wealth. I'm blessed, though, that they have brought this news to me. For with wealth that the river guided me, I was able to build a magnificent palace." The long end of the story is that if the river hadn't overrun its banks, if the princes hadn't come by and told him to maybe look at the glass half full, that he wouldn't have been looking for a palace in a different place, found the way to pay for the palace, the point is. So how many times have we gotten so discouraged at what was instead of what could be right in front of you? A story about the guy who was destitute and he sold his land. This story was told about 100 years ago or so. And he sold it for a fraction of what it was worth. And some little kids were running across his field and they found this rock. And they brought it to the person who owned the field. And we found this rock, and they had it up there on the mantle. And the guy came in, what's that? Longer story short, they didn't realize that it was a huge diamond. So the owner took the boys back out. Where did you find it? So long story short, the whole property was full of what the story says, acres of diamonds. So the man didn't even realize, he didn't realize at all that he was living on. He owned acres of diamonds and didn't realize what he had in the first place. How many times haven't you and I realized the blessings that we have all around us, but we're looking at other people's stuff and other people's things and what we think we should have right now, instead of all this wonderful stuff that we have right now, right in our own homes, right in our own families. We look at the glass as half empty instead of half full. Proverbs 16 says, the heart of man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps. So if you and I are, for lack of a better way to say it, more apt to listen to those internal hunches to go this way or to go that way, we're going to find a whole lot more opportunity to, I think, climb a lot faster than we would try to figure it out on our own. I'm still learning that. I'll probably learn that until the day I die. In the Bible, the term coincidence is used only a few times. But each time that it's used, it is intimated that God set the situation up for a purpose. And the actual text is Luke chapter 10, where in Luke 10, verse 31, it says, "And by chance there came down a certain priest that way and saw a guy who was beat up by robbers." By chance in this text means that these people that were given the opportunity to make a difference with the guy who was robbed and almost killed had an opportunity. They were led down this path to make a difference, but they chose not to make a difference. There are times in your life and my life when we're directed we're prompted to do a certain thing or to go a certain way to see somebody who needs what we have. And sometimes we turn the other way. Whereas the story continues to go on. A guy who would normally be the enemy of the guy who he eventually helped took the opportunity to make a difference in the guy's life who was robbed. Not only helped him, but paid for his care. But the religious folk that should have done something chose not to do something because they had other things that they had to do. Somebody find this as divine inspiration, for God to leverage us with limited education or all the education in the world, all our pain, all the baggage. God wants to leverage us to do something for other people in our lives every day. And sometimes it's just a word of encouragement. Sometimes it's just a story, because you and I both know that stories tend to stick with people so much more than just a bunch of facts. One person said that serendipity is when God allows your efforts to be infinitely more productive than they could be without him. You do the hard work, and God allows the right person to notice. You step out in faith, and the doors open that you didn't even know existed. Because we only see a piece of the story. So, to me, if my hunch is to do a certain thing, but I can't see past this thing, trust is that you take the step without knowing what's beyond here. But when you take the step, and maybe it takes another 3 or 4 steps, then you're going to run it right up to an opportunity that you didn't know existed because you weren't afraid to take the big steps and to do the things that didn't make total sense at the time. Does that make any sense at all to anybody? Right? So you gotta find another way. Finding another way, I think, allows God to remove some of the roadblocks in your life, because you're going to find that the more times that you step out, and that more times you get off the quote highway that's blocked with traffic, and take these other side opportunities and side roads and side things, that you can see things and experience things that you couldn't have if that backup didn't occur in your life. I happen to think that sometimes backups happen to sometimes force us hyper people to take Route 1 to get around 95. Does that make any sense? So the struggles that you may come across may be God ordained to get you to look at things a little differently than you would if you're just, you're so used to going down 95 or whatever road that you choose to go down that day, right? Turn over to 2 Corinthians chapter 12. I want to invest a few minutes there. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, it is talking about a guy named Paul. Paul in the New Testament was a guy who was an enemy of the new church, the new Christian church, these new people called Christians. Within about 30 or 40 years or so of Christ passing away, Paul was, let's just say, and to keep it short, his life was changed pretty amazingly. So in 2 Corinthians 12, starting about verse number 7 or so, it says, because of the this is Paul talking, because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, he's saying in English, that because God has blessed me, this is Paul talking, with all this great wisdom and all these great stories and words of wisdom for folks, right? In that same verse, that he calls it in this text, that was given him a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan, it says, to torment me, to keep me from exalting myself. Now, if you know anything about that temperament, like Paul had, Paul's ego was huge. People with that type of type A personalities, not all, but a good majority of them, their egos are really big, meaning that they're never wrong. Their way or the highway. You you don't come my way and do my thing, I'm right, you're never right, I'm always right. So Paul had that baggage that he had to deal with. So in verse 8, it says, concerning this, he says, I prayed to God 3 times that he would take away this. He called it this thorn in the flesh. But in verse 9, it says, God responded, my grace is sufficient for you. For power, listen, for power is perfected in weakness, right? Most gladly, he says, therefore I'll boast about my weakness so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Then he says in verse 10, therefore I am well content with weakness and insults and with distresses, with persecutions, in difficulties. But in the Greek it says cramped spaces. That he was comfortable in cramped spaces. For Christ's sake, he says, for I am weak. When I'm weak, then God is strong. In fact, it also talks, let me jump ahead of it. In the Jewish text, it says this, therefore, lest I should be, listen, too exalted, this is Paul talking, especially by the excess of his knowledge, it goes on down, that Satan was using people to, quote, using their fists on me. Now, people don't even have to put their fists on you to hurt you. They can hurt you with their words, can't they? I think all of us have been hurt with words more than a few times. Verse 8, he says that this is the Jewish text, that he called on Adonai, or God, that he might depart from me. And skip down to verse 10. But then God responds in this text, I take pleasure in weaknesses and insults and hardships and persecutions. For when I'm weak, then he says in the original text, or one of the original text, then I'm a strong man. Or another way to say it, this text, because of the phenomenal revelations I've received, this is Paul talking in a paraphrase, and on account of the vast number of revelations God has entrusted to me, and to hinder the highly visible progress I'm making for God, a special messenger was sent from Satan to harass me. Anybody have any people in your life who harassed you more than a few times? Right? With constant distractions and headaches. I had a neighbor one time like that. We'll leave that alone. There's no doubt about it. Those whom Satan has stirred up against me want my head on a stake. And that's S-T-A-K-E, not S-T-E-A-K. Satan, listen, is using these people to constantly buffet me, remember the Greek? To use the fist, right? And distract me in an attempt to keep me from reaching a higher level of visibility. So Paul, in this text, in this paraphrase, in this commentary, if you will, was believing that the thorn in his flesh was people trying to stop him from doing the stuff that he was supposed to be doing anyway. Some people have said that the thorn in his flesh was poor eyesight, or he had hunched over back, or he was short, or whatever. I'm not there. I'm not for sure. But this understanding gives you a whole new look on what it could have been. So God allowed Paul's ego to be in check. Because I don't know about you, but when your ego is so huge that there's really no room for God in your life. Say it again. When your ego is so huge, there's no room for God in your life. So oftentimes, I think God brings situations down the road for us to keep our ego in check, because then God wants us to be pliable and used and enable God to work through us. Whereas if we think we're all that, then there's no room for God to work through us, right? So Paul was saying that even though I'm struggling, even though I'm going through all this stuff and I'm being attacked and being punched, he says that I will push on. In fact, not other translation says, quote, it is in the weakness, listen, it is in the weakness that my power is fully felt. Let me share it again. It is in the weakness that God's power is fully felt. So again, the size of your why determines how hard you push through your struggles. The size of your why determines how hard you push through your struggles. So when your love for humanity, when your love for your neighbor, when your love for your family, when you love for being homeless, or not being homeless, I should say, will get your butt out of bed every day to go to work, that's a pretty big why, isn't it? That's what I'm talking about. When you love people more than you love your own peace, when you love people more than your own desire to just chill and to focus on the person in the mirror, then people are going to be impacted. People are going to be helped. So I end with a quote by Susie Chasm, who writes, "The true test of a warrior, listen, the true test of a warrior is how your stance holds up after any circumstance." I'll say it again. The true test of a warrior is how your stance holds up after any circumstance. Meaning, even after the stormiest storm, a true warrior will still reflect the brilliant rays of the magnificent sun through both his or her eyes. You may get hit by a sudden lightning or take severe beatings from a cruel wind, but you will always get back up and stand strong on your feet again. Soak in the sunlight and be prepared to get hit by even the most merciless hail, time and time and time again. So how your stance is going to be after being hit across the head will determine whether you get up and whether you keep going again. So no matter what you're going through, you must find a way around it, through it, under it, or over it. I told Tammy on the way down to Myrtle Beach, I said, I wish to God we could turn this stinking van into a helicopter. And we just fly right over this mess and just, I couldn't. Tammy's like, oh, no, you can't even drive the van without, almost wrecking. There ain't no way we're getting a helicopter, you know what I'm saying? But the point of the whole text here today is that you have to keep going in order to find another way around it. And if you allow God to leverage not only the good stuff in you, but the not so good stuff in you, you're going to be able to get so much more accomplished, not just for yourself, in fact, not even for yourself, but for other people. And when you're a blessing to other people,